Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional, whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. In her book, What If Everybody Understood Child Development, 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 quotes Alfred North Whitehead as saying, "I lay it down as an educational axiom that in teaching, you will come to grief as soon as you forget that your pupils have bodies." Many of us are seeing that grief in the classroom as different policies and practices seem to forget that our children have bodies. As one of the foremost child development experts in education, 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 has devoted nearly 40 years to advocating for more play and more movement. She's been an educational consultant specializing in the development and education of the whole child. A former adjunct instructor with the University of New Hampshire, she is the founder and director of Moving and Learning, which is now 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 Keynotes and Consulting, and the author of 19 books, a few of which we'll discuss today. Ray is known for her lively and informative workshop and keynote presentations and has shared her expertise with some groups you'll definitely recognize, like Sesame Street, Head Start Bureau, Centers for Disease Control, President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports, Nickelodeon's Blue's Clues, Gymboree, Hasbro, Mattel, Nike, as well as various schools, parents, and state health departments throughout the country. Ray served on the task force of the National Association for Sport and Physical Education, which is now Shape America, that created the national guidelines for early childhood physical activity. She's a member of several advisory boards and serves on the executive committee of the Academy of Education, Arts, and Sciences International, and as an expert for NBC's Education Nation. In addition, Ray is co-founder of the BAM Radio Network, the world's largest online education radio network, where she currently hosts Student Centricity, interviewing other experts in the field of child development and education, play research, the neurosciences, and more. And even with all of that, she's found time to share some thoughts with us today. You can find show notes for this episode at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 16. So now let's jump in. Ray, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Amanda.
So I'm really fascinated to hear kind of the path that different professionals take in the early childhood profession. So I'd love to just start out by hearing how you got into education and kind of where you went from there.
So I may have taken the weirdest route ever known to personhood. I don't know. I just started, well, I had been a dancer, and then I started teaching dance to young children and realized very quickly that they didn't need dance so much as they needed opportunities for creative self-expression and, body and spatial awareness was important. And so I started studying movement education, and it sort of took over my life. And then I became the movement lady who went into child care centers and preschools in my area, and, I would do the 45 minutes with the children and then leave. And then I hired and trained other instructors so they could sort of be in the, I could be in more than one place at a time. And it just sort of grew from there. I had a local Head Start organization call and say, "We hear you do this movement stuff. Would you be interested in training our staff?" And I said, "Oh, sure, I'll try that." And, and then one day I was at NAEYC conference, and I had written before. I grew up thinking I was going to be a writer. And then an editor, I can't even remember what they were called now. You know how publishers gobble each other up. Said, "Would you be interested in writing a textbook?" And I said, "Sure, I'll try that." So I just kept saying, "Sure, I'll try that," and following my instincts, I guess. It's been a weird path, but a wonderful one, and I'm really glad that I kept saying sure.
Yeah. Well, I love that path. I love that you started with dance as more of like a performance piece, and that it drew you into more of the process behind it and all of the development that fed into it. And I love that you expanded on that passion and that it took you in all these different directions.
Yeah, nobody grows up thinking, gee, I think I'll be a children's physical activity consultant when I grow I mean, who knew even what that was? And before the internet existed, which I was around a long time before the internet existed, I was the only person I knew who was doing this weird stuff. So it was a little bit isolating, but, you just do what you do. So here I am.
Follow your passion, follow your instincts. So what was the most interesting, maybe interesting in the sense as kind of odd and wouldn't have made that connection, or interesting in really enjoyable as you were doing different consulting work and working with different agencies and programs? What was one of the most interesting jobs that you had consulting on movement?
Well, when I went to Sesame Street, when the Sesame Street Research Department asked me to consult, and I've been there twice. I remember the first time I was absolutely a nervous wreck. I probably was the second time, too, because I remember a massive headache before I spoke. They had, the first time they had all of the writers. Back then they had, the magazine and just lots of different arms of their program. And they were all there, and they were all listening to my position on, I was talking about cooperation versus competition then, which is something I've been babbling about for years, and nobody seems to be listening.
Oh, they're listening. We're listening.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, that was really exciting, I think the most rewarding professional experience I ever had nothing to do with movement, really. I had done some a workshop for a local technical college, the early childhood program, and it was at the end of a year when I was absolutely fried. I remember being in front of these young people, these college students, and working very hard to think of what was supposed to come next out of my mouth. And I remember just thinking, just stay upright, because I thought I was going to fall down at any moment. I was exhausted. I had done so much during that fall and leading up to the fall. And then it was the most surprising thing. Their professor called me a couple of months later and said, our students nominated you to be the commencement speaker.
Oh, wow.
And I said, why? And it was just fascinating. But, it didn't really have anything to do with children's physical activity or active learning or, teaching to the whole child or any of the things I'm about. But I took all of my knowledge at that point and put it into a speech for them. And you've done workshops and keynotes where you can't get everybody's attention, and they like to socialize, and this one you could actually hear a pin drop. It was just so rewarding to have everybody listening to me.
That is amazing.
It was fun.
Well, I love that. So we've mentioned you started in movement, and that expanded to movement in early childhood, and that's brought you into a broader early child development focus.
Yeah.
But I'm curious from the movement standpoint, because that's always been a running thread, a passion in all of your career. So in this, you've been in early childhood for over 35 years. So what have you seen in that span of your career on the topic of movement, the needs that you saw at the beginning of your career and the needs and concerns on both ends, at the beginning and where you are presently?
That's such a good question, Amanda. I remember clearly in the beginning when I would say the words children and movement at the same time, early childhood professionals would back away from me. Metaphorically, but I would feel them backing away from me as though I were a dentist holding a drill. And they didn't want to hear the words children and movement in the same sentence. As far as they were concerned, children moved plenty.
Right.
And I know that inclination is still there. We still equate sitting with learning. We still want more control over the children in the classroom, so we're afraid of movement and children bouncing off the walls and that sort of thing. But over time, early childhood professionals have come to understand the importance of movement. And what's interesting now is they seem to grasp it more now that the children are sitting more often, are being forced to sit more often, with accountability and academics, taking control of even early childhood education. The children aren't getting to move the way we did as kids and the way their predecessors did. And I think that because it's missing so much, early childhood professionals realize just how valuable it is. So I'm a little bit more popular than I used to be. But I don't know. It just has felt like 38 years of beating my head against a wall.
That's so interesting to me. So you feel like it's valued more by educators, but it's actually valued more because kids are getting it less.
That's my impression, yes. Yeah, because they see the impact that it's having on children. When Peter Gray talks about growing depression happening at the same time the children are getting less opportunity to play, he's making a lot of sense. It's not a coincidence.
Right. So for those who maybe aren't familiar with your work, why is movement so important in early childhood, but also in education specifically? Why are those not two separate concepts?
My goodness, that's a big, big, big question. I've written much on that topic. Why is movement important? Well, first of all, we were born to move. We were created to move. Mother Nature intended for us to move. So whether we're talking about, babies getting tummy time and crawling and creeping and doing all that wonderful cross-lateral stuff, or learning, the gaining the body and the spatial awareness and the feeling confident with the basics of movement, the locomotor skills and the non-locomotor skills. And there's just so much to say. It sort of depends on whether you're looking at movement from a physical aspect, a social emotional aspect, or a cognitive aspect, because movement contributes to all of those. If we're looking at physical alone, we have statistics that are really, really scary. That 40%, almost half of the children 5 to 8, show at least one heart disease risk factor, including obesity, which, is a big problem, no pun intended, and growing more rapidly among children than among adults, and hypertension. We should not be using the words hypertension and 5-year-old in the same sentence. The first signs of arteriosclerosis are appearing at age 5. Heaven help me, this is tragic stuff. And these things didn't used to show up in anyone under the age of 30. So it's new, and it's related to the sedentary behaviors. If we're talking about social emotional development, children need to have the opportunities, to take turns and to cooperate and learn to share space. And when they're engaged in active play, they're problem solving, they're involved in conflict resolution. I could go on and on and on. And then the cognitive piece is the one that most people don't really connect with movement, because we have a propensity, at least in this part of the world, to think of the mind and body as completely separate entities, which is utter nonsense. It all started when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, and I don't know why people believed him, and I don't know why it's lasted as long as it has, but, it's just crazy. We have more and more and more research showing the link between physical activity and academic success, attitude towards school. I can't remember. It's Dr. Charles Hillman, I believe, and I don't know what university he's from. I've used his images of brain scans many, many times, and the one on the left shows a brain that's not very lit up, and that's after sitting, and then the one on the right shows a brain that's got all kinds of colorful lights in it, and that's just after a 20-minute walk. So, there is a connection between the mind and the body, and I could go on and on and on about that, but the prevailing attitude is that one has nothing to do with the other. When the Texas State School Board was considering daily physical education, they had one board member speak up and say, well, if we have daily PE, the kids will be healthy but dumb.
Right.
Yeah, so they just don't, they just think that the mind and body have nothing to do with one another. So I don't know if really that answered your question about why children need to move. I mean, also from the cognitive perspective, when we're speaking specifically about young children, you know that they have to physically experience concepts in order to understand them. Mm-hmm. So I started off with movement education as just a physical thing, and then began to realize its role in education and learning. And, I began to understand that children need to get high and low to really understand those quantitative concepts. They have to act out words in order to grasp their meaning. They have to experience their personal space, and then that translates in how they write their letters, so there's a whole lot of connections, Amanda.
Yeah. Well, I think listening to you speak, it becomes very clear how you moved from focusing on movement to whole child development, because it really is woven into every single aspect of healthy whole child development. I think you did a great job of tying all of those pieces together, that they're all connected through movement.
Yeah, they are. And it's just not something that many... I don't know. Educators are somewhat familiar with some of it. Parents and policymakers, not so much. And I think they're the people we really need to reach with the message, because they just don't get it.
So particularly on that, where you mentioned there was some resistance with parents and policymakers, and you gave the example with PE, that they saw that as a separate physical class. So one thing that I hear frequently is when you start talking about movement, there are some people who hear it just as, so PE and recess. Are we getting enough PE and recess time? And those are important, but there's also a piece missing if we're not looking at movement within the classroom, within the learning experience, which you did just mention a little bit, the experience of moving and acting out concepts and getting all the way around that. Can you tell us more about the brain research around the need for movement within the learning environment? Not just that kids need to move and it's separate from their learning environment, but that they need it in their learning environment as well.
Yeah, as you say, this is the piece that most people aren't familiar with. I don't know why we associate sitting with learning. Maybe because it's always been done that way, and that's just not a good enough excuse for anything.
Right.
I'm sorry. But you've got people like Eric Jensen who've written so many books on brain-based learning, and he tells us that, the research tells us that sitting increases fatigue and reduces concentration. So why would we want them to sit more? I in my keynotes, I tell people, maybe you've sat at a conference all day long or on a plane all day long. And at the end of the day, you've wondered, why are you so tired? And the reason is because you've been sitting. It makes you tired to sit. And there's, more and more research coming out about the health risks of sitting. But if we understand child development, we understand that children need to physically experience these concepts. They can't they're not abstract thinkers yet. If you take the word slow, it's just a collection of 4 letters, each one an abstraction, a symbol that represents something, and doesn't mean anything to the children until they get to move slowly, maybe while listening to slow music, so they're engaging all of those senses. We know that the more senses we use in the learning process, the more information we retain. So it's not a matter of just filling kids' heads with some information and then having them fill in bubbles and then it's pretty much gone. That isn't education. That isn't learning. I don't know what that is. It's a waste of time. It's what it is. Again, to refer to Eric Jensen, he says let's see, what's the example he uses? If we hadn't heard the capital of Peru for 5 years, would we still remember it? And then he asks, if we hadn't ridden a bike for 5 years, would we still remember how to do it? And of course, it's unlikely I would remember the capital of Peru 5 years after hearing it if it didn't have any personal meaning to me. But riding a bike, because you physically experience it, you retain it. It doesn't go away. So
interesting. So it sounds like we have two different camps to educate. There are the parents and policymakers, maybe not always on the same end, but one category, and then there's the people in the classroom, the educators. So what can you say for those, whichever camp they may be in, if it's a parent who's concerned there's not enough movement in their child's day, or if there's an educator who is on board with movement but doesn't feel like they're getting through either to their administrators or maybe even to parents, what are some things that people can do to advocate for more movement?
Yeah, advocacy is so important. It's my hope that if we educate the parents, because they're getting so much misinformation these days. They're being told that earlier is better, whether we're talking about academics or athletics. There's always been the belief that all children are the same, so if they're at the same age and the same grade, then they should be able to do the same things. And just so much misinformation coming at them. But if we educate the parents as to what is right and developmentally appropriate for their children, I hope that they will become advocates for it. I know that organizations like the American Association for the Child's Right to Play, which makes me sad just saying that,
right,
to think that we need such an association. They're the country's number one advocate for recess, and I've read stories there about a single mom who sees the impact on the child of not having recess at all, because that's being eliminated in so many schools. And they have taken up the cause, and they have won the battle. So if we help them understand the importance of, physical activity in so many other ways, then hopefully they'll take up that battle as well. But whether you're a teacher going to an administrator, or a parent going to, a school board or a principal or whatever it is, gather your research. You have to have the research. And then I learned this from interviewing some state AEYC executive directors on my radio program about advocacy. Be brief, and be respectful, and that's the way you make an impression. I think that if, maybe in both instances, it behooves people to also find other like-minded individuals, not to go it alone. I think especially when you're a parent, if you're approaching an administrator, find other people who feel the same way, and because there's strength in numbers. So it's I don't know what we do about the policymakers. One excellent piece of advice that came from that same radio interview was to invite them into the classroom and let them see what developmentally appropriate practice looks like, or have them sit and fill in bubbles and see how they like it.
Right. I do remember in my teacher training back in my undergraduate days, I remember having a block of classes it was like 3 hours long, and I remember one day just sitting there thinking, I want to beat my head on this table and get up and run around the room, and I instantly thought, oh my goodness, that's what kids feel like. That's really what this feels like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe not such a bad idea.
More. Sorry, they needed more because they're the most active segment of our population, So, yeah, if you felt that way, imagine what it feels like to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. It's just appalling. And there are other scientific reasons, the release of norepinephrine and dopamine and all of those brain chemicals that are released with a little bit. So if you had gotten, I don't advocate beating your head against the desk, but if you'd gotten up and run around the room, those those chemicals would have been released in your brain and you would have been more prepared to continue learning.
We give some really great tips on advocating, and one of the first ones that you mentioned was to make sure you gather your resources. And I think your book, What If Everybody Understood Child Development, is a great resource for advocating for developmentally appropriate practice in general, but you have a lot of great resources that are specific to movement, because that's a big piece of it. It's such a great resource. I've recommended it to a lot of people for the same purpose, that they want to go talk about something or they want to approach their school board about getting more recess time. And I say, there's some great research in here that you can reference. So tell us a little bit. I'll make sure that I link to that book in the show notes. But tell us a little bit about how that book came to be and how it's set up. It's a little bit different than just a front cover to back cover book, which I think is really useful.
Thank you. Oh, if I may say so, I love that book. I really love that book.
You may say so.
It started as a piece for Huffington Post that I wrote called "What If Everybody Understood Child Development?" because that was a question just weighing on my mind. I mean, just if we think about that question, what if everybody understood child development? Parents, policymakers, educators, administrators, children's lives and education will look so much different because, to my way of thinking, we're doing so much wrong these days, so much wrong, and it's just having such a negative impact on the children. So I wrote this piece. It got, 25,000 Facebook likes and 2,500 Facebook shares. It was astonishing, and I realized I wasn't alone, which is, a great thing about the Internet. We don't have to be alone anymore, and it gives us a voice, which we didn't have before. And there were others who felt the same way I did, and I don't really remember the leap from the post to the book. Isn't that terrible? I mean, I sort of blanked out on it completely. But the book, as you say, isn't a typical format. It's 29 short essays, or rants, because I feel like I'm just sort of ranting, about issues that I think that's certainly important to me, and I think should be important to every educator, like the fact that sitting does not equal learning, and the fact that all children are not the same, and that, earlier is not better, and play is not a four-letter word, and there's a lot of nots in there, a lot of negatives. But yeah, so...
But I do think it's a very positive book. It's very hopeful. Like you said, it does point out a lot of the things that we're getting wrong, a lot of what we're doing that runs counter to what we actually know is good for kids. But I find a lot of hope in that there is, like you said, that you're not alone in saying that there is the research to back you up, and that you put it into this book for other people to take that. And I think there's a lot of power in that, and because of that, I feel like it's a very hopeful book.
Thank you. Well, I do, each essay ends with what's a teacher to do. So I have some suggestions and additional resources, because it is very brief. I don't know if I'm telling tales out of school here, but I know the former executive director of the National Association for Elementary School Principals, and so many elementary school principals have come to that position after being maybe, 8th grade social studies teachers or high school football coaches or something. And as you know, Amanda, early childhood is a whole other animal. They're just not, they're not even the same as children grades 4 and up, not even close. And it really requires an understanding of early childhood. And I talked to the former executive director of NAESP and said I would really like to help principals, your elementary school principals, understand early childhood. And she said, send me the book. And I sent her the book, and she gave it to a committee. And, there's the death knell right there when you say committee, and whoever they were. They decided it wasn't, what was the word, rigorous enough.
Interesting.
And I thought, oh my, well, that's the problem right there, isn't it? I mean, I wasn't going for rigor, and rigor isn't what we're supposed to be going for in early childhood. And so the idea was dismissed. And it's just fascinating to me that happened.
Interesting. It's good to know, though, that there is, so it sounds like there is an interest, though, in getting more early childhood training for elementary principals.
Yes, I think that has, well, I think that has been one of their initiatives. I don't know under the leadership of the new executive director, but it's, yeah, they really do need to understand what is developmentally appropriate and how different young children are from older children. If they're going to have a positive impact on these children's lives and education.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have your newest book now is called Active Learning Across the Curriculum. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
So tell us about this one. Now, maybe before you tell us about this one, do you know how many books in total you've written? What number is this?
I think it's 19.
19, wow.
Yeah, every time I finish one, I think, that's it, I'm done. But I have 2 more that I want to write, and I don't know why. That itch, that itch comes, and I have to scratch it. But yeah, I have an idea for 2 more. One is a parenting book, and I have to tell you, I've written 2 parenting books, and they have failed miserably. Because really, nobody the first one, my publisher, in their infinite wisdom, titled Your Active Child. And so anybody who picked it off the shelves, in that very crowded parenting book space, thought it had to do with hyperactivity. And they were very disappointed when they found out that it didn't. So
it was about all children being active.
Yeah, it was about the need for physical activity. And really, I don't remember what it was, but I know I had the perfect title, but publishers always have their own ideas. So
right. So tell us about active learning across the curriculum.
Well, it's pretty much what the title says. I'm a big believer, as I've mentioned, in children physically experiencing concepts, and so active learning across the curriculum is divided into the content areas of art, language arts, or emergent literacy, whatever you want to call that, art, language arts, math, music, science, and social studies. And under each of those content areas of the different concepts that, under language arts we have, letter recognition and word comprehension and all of those kinds of subjects, with activities for the classroom, for the little ones to experience these concepts, because in experiencing them, they better understand them. And no child ever grew up and said, gee, my favorite memory of school was rote memorization.
Right.
They remember the physical experiences they had. They remember the fun activities that they did. Jacques Dalcroze, who was a music educator way back when, said, I look upon joy as the most powerful of all mental stimuli. And I love that, and
beautiful.
It's learning is joyful for young children until we squash the joy right out of learning, and make it about sitting still and doing things that children were never meant to do. So I get back on my soapbox. But yeah, active learning across the curriculum is I like it too. I like this book too.
You love all your children, right?
I do, and I guess I'm not supposed to show favorites, right?
Right. Well, and I love that this gives, you've got a lot of, in the first book that we talked about, What If Everybody Understood Child Development, there's a lot of the theory and the why, and you do have a lot of application steps in there as well, but I love that this active learning across the curriculum gives like lesson plans, basically. So here's how you actually do an active learning lesson, and from that, then teachers can then create their own lessons going forward. Once they see a few of those in action, they can then expand those to learn so many different concepts in a more active way.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. Because, I mean, with each of those lesson plans, there are alternate activities and ways to expand the ideas, and I hope that it will spark their imagination and make them feel more comfortable and confident going forward with their own ideas. So,
Such wonderful resources that you've put out in the world.
Oh, thank you.
You're such a great advocate for children and for childhood and for play, and it's just really a blessing to have you.
Oh, thank you. It hurts my heart, when I hear stories from parents or teachers. I mean, early childhood teachers out there are just being asked to do things that they know are wrong, and it's so hard for them these days. But the children, oh my goodness, the children are just so unhappy and so unhealthy, and it hurts my heart. So I try to do what I can, as one person, but then, there's you're doing so much for the children as well. And because of the internet, I know that there are others out there, and that I'm not beating my head against the wall all by myself anymore.
Right. I think there's strength in numbers, and I think that you are making a big difference. So thank you for the work that you do, the advocacy that you do, and thanks for joining us today and helping us all learn how we can better stand up for children and for childhood.
Oh, you're so welcome, Amanda, and thank you for inviting me on the show.
Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes, including where to find Ray's books at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 16. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com. And follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.